Oh, no.
Ready to roll? Okay.
And
Ready? Okay, the title of this paper, McDowell and Heidegger on spontaneous receptivity. In recent years, a growing trend has been the attempt to open up the lines of communication between the analytic and Continental traditions. A major obstacle faced by such endeavors is the problem of defining the traditions in the first place. One way to bootstrap our way into a solution to this problem is to examine how various analytic and Continental philosophers addressed identical issues, thereby yielding definite points of comparison between representatives of the different traditions. This procedure, however, gives rise to problems of its own, since the disparate philosophical idioms adopted by the traditions can make it difficult to determine if the same issue is really being addressed. Still, promising cases for such comparisons can be found, and today I'll examine what I believe to be a case in point. It's often been claimed that the analytic and Continental traditions parted ways by virtue of their interpretations of Kant. It would seem then that the field of Kant interpretation would offer a relatively solid ground for comparing the traditions. And in the Kant interpretations of Heidegger and McDowell, we find a particularly promising case for doing so, since they both see Kant's notion of subjectivity as spontaneous receptivity as lying at the heart of Kantian thought, and they both articulate their own thought in terms of their assessments of Kant's alleged failure to draw the ultimate conclusion of subjectivity's spontaneous receptive structure. Now, this next part is on the handout, or at least parts of it I'll point out when they happen. For McDowell, Kant is important because he shows the way to resolve a pivotal difficulty plaguing contemporary philosophy. That is the dilemma between the myth of the given and radical coherentism. And McDowell says that Kant shows a way to resolve this insofar as Kant holds that knowledge of the objective world is made possible through a combination of receptivity and spontaneity, or in other words, through a notion of subjectivity as spontaneous receptivity. The dilemma originates in the attempt to maintain what McDowell calls a minimal empiricism, which is the view that we can experience the world and that such experiences can tell us something about what the world is like. And at the top of the handout, those are the two conditions, A, and B there. So now I'm going to talk about those for a minute. Only by meeting these two conditions, being of or from the world and revealing something about the world, that's A and B, can experience count as being directed toward the world. So those are conditions for world-directed representations. And McDowell argues that there's an apparent conflict between these two fundamental conditions for world-directedness. Beginning with the first condition, that's A, in order for experience to be of the world, the experiencing subject's representations must be determined by the experienced world. Subjectivity must passively accept what the world shows to it. That is, the experiencing subject must be receptive. So we go for representation of the world, they've got the subject has to be passive or receptive. Right. That is, the experiencing subject must be receptive. For representations that are, and here's the reason, representations that are impervious to the world would be determined completely internally or generated by the representing subject itself. Therefore, world-directed experiences must be undergone by a passive, receptive subject, since otherwise they would not be experiences of the world at all, and so would fail to satisfy the first condition of world-directedness. However, subjectivity's receptivity seems to preclude the subject's passively received representations from telling it anything about the world. That's the second condition there, B. That is, satisfying the first condition for world-directedness appears to render meeting the second condition impossible. To see why this is the case, first note that for a representation to represent that the world is in a certain way is for that representation to be conceptualized. It represents the world as being of a certain character, and thus as a belief. By examining the nature of beliefs, then, McDowell finds what is characteristic of representations that inform us about the world, that's condition B, and he maintains that Belief representations are determined by their location within a system of beliefs or a worldview. Therefore, a belief's identity is not completely determined by the experience in which it originates, since a given experience could yield a representation that could be located in a variety of places within a belief system. As disparate beliefs can be implied by the same perceptual episode, then, the representing subject must actively determine how the representation in question is to fit into their belief system. In this way, the receptive subject is also active or spontaneous. So there you have the two conditions for world-directed representations. World-directed representations, then, insofar as they're about the world, must be actively constituted by the representing subject, because they have to be fit into a belief system. There's a lot of different places a particular representation can be put into a belief system. Yet their coming from the world requires that the representing subject passively receive them. And it's the tension between these requirements that's given rise to contemporary philosophy's oscillation between the myth of the given and radical coherentism. There in the handout you see A only, B only, those are different options. Specifically, recognition of the fact that world-directedness demands a passive subject, the first condition, has led to the myth of the given, that is, theories that argue for a distinguishable moment of pure receptivity, characterized by representations that possess non-conceptual content. But recognition of the demand that subjectivity actively constitute its world-directed representations has inspired the coherentist rejection of a pure given. That is, theories arguing that since all representational content must be conceptualized, subjectivity must be purely active, its world-directed representations being internally generated. That's B only. Both types of theory are inadequate because each satisfies one of the criteria of world-directedness while failing to satisfy the other, hence the oscillation between. Okay, now B, McDowell's version of Kant. According to McDowell, contemporary philosophy has moved between these positions because it's viewed receptivity and spontaneity as incompatible, and so has had to maintain that at the most fundamental level of world-directed representation, only one of these dimensions is exercised. McDowell sees that the only way to end this quarrel is to find a way to combine receptivity and spontaneity at every level of empirical experience, and he notes that this is precisely what Kant attempted with his notion of subjectivity as spontaneous receptivity. Still, McDowell claims Kant ultimately failed to do justice to this, his most important insight. McDowell's diagnosis of Kant's failure runs as follows. Now, this is specifically that part of the handout B. Kant correctly maintains that spontaneity and receptivity are intrinsically combined, quote, from the standpoint of experience. That is, insofar as Kant conceives of the phenomenal world as subject independent, and thus of subjectivity as passive in its reception of phenomenal objects, he avoids radical coherentism. That's B1A. And insofar as Kant conceives of the phenomenal world as subject-dependent, and thus of subjectivity as active, he avoids the myth of the given. However, Kant fails to maintain the inextricable connection between receptivity and spontaneity from the, quote, transcendental perspective. That is, subjectivity's relation to the noumenal world is one in which things are purely subject-independent. So that's 2 there, the transcendental perspective. And according to McDowell, empirical experience of phenomena is rooted in subjectivities being affected by noumena. Therefore, Kant's admission of the thing in itself results in his falling prey to the myth of the given. But why would Kant revert to an erroneous position that he could have successfully avoided with his notion of spontaneous receptivity? That is, why did he revert to this transcendental perspective that sticks him back into the myth of the given? For McDowell, the reason lies in Kant's acceptance of the modern scientific conception of nature as a realm of mechanistic efficient causes and effects. This conception of nature leads to the myth of the given, since subjectivity's cognitive relation to natural objects, so conceived, if you think of nature that way, could only be purely receptive, for all of its representations would be the result of necessary causal processes rather than being spontaneously integrated into a system of beliefs. Accepting this conception of nature, Kant's ontology must include a purely subject-independent realm, and since the phenomenal world is not such a realm, Kant was compelled to posit the thing in itself to play this role. Thus, Kant's position begins with his groundbreaking insight into the need for a combination of spontaneity and receptivity in order for experience to be possible, but he combines this with an acceptance of the scientific conception of nature, causing his reversion to the myth of the given. So Kant can't solve the problem of the oscillation between coherentism and the myth of the given, or between a purely active and a purely passive notion of subjectivity. With this diagnosis of Kant's relapse into the myth of the given, we find McDowell's own solution to the problem. That is, a reconceptualization of nature so as to include two dimensions, one of which holds the key to the possibility of world-directed representations. That aspect, second aspect of nature being what McDowell calls, second nature. So that is now C. McDowell's got these two different conceptions of nature. Here's specifically the way it works. For McDowell, the two dimensions of nature are nature as a system of mechanistic causes and effects, that's A, and a second aspect of nature that inhabits what McDowell calls the space of reasons, that is, the relational system of beliefs into which belief representations must be actively integrated, that's B. As we've seen, such representations can only be possessed by an active representing subject. Thus, insofar as world-directed representations must be beliefs, they can't be the result of nothing but passive causal interactions with the world. What gives such representations their belief character is not the fact that occurrences in the world impinge on the subject's sensory faculties, thereby causing the occurrence of certain representations, but rather the fact that worldly occurrences can justify holding beliefs about the world. The human subject's ability to take experiences as reasons for holding beliefs is its possession of a second nature, and McDowell sees the positing of such a second nature as solving the problem of world-directed representations due to its spontaneous receptive character. That is, exercises of second nature as belief-generating are as belief-generating spontaneous and are as natural receptive. So so at the bottom there you see sort of McDowell's answer to Kant is, with this idea of second nature, it's the same thing as Kant, but without nature as having only that modern scientific picture. So that's Kant without nature A only, which is to say Kant without a purely receptive notion of subjectivity, which is what he says you get when you posit the thing in itself. So it's Kant without noumena, and therefore a spontaneous receptive subject. Now on to Heidegger, the other side of that handout. In his interpretation of Kant, Heidegger views Kant's conception of finitude as the heart of the first critique. For Heidegger, Kant's pursuit of the conditions of the possibility of experience is an explication of the fundamental structure of human finite subjectivity, which is spontaneous receptivity. That is, a structure whose discovery is Kant's greatest achievement. So first of all, the way Kant reads Heidegger, the finite subject, which is what Kant is mainly interested in, is equivalent to a spontaneous receptive subject. And here's why. Heidegger finds the connection between finitude and spontaneous receptivity in Kant's distinction between finite and infinite intuition. For Kant, the characteristic mark of the finite subject is its possession of a receptive dimension. That is, while infinite cognition creates its object through the act of cognition, the object of finite cognition must already be on hand prior to being cognized. There you have in the handout A, right, a finite subject is such that the representation doesn't create its object. So whereas infinite subjectivity is purely spontaneous, finite subjectivity is receptive. However, Kant's finite subjectivity can't be purely receptive. The reason for this, and that's what's going to fill in B there where the question marks are. The reason for this can be clarified by considering Kant's famous letter to Marcus Hertz of 1772. Heidegger, and that's the next part of the handout, that's the charting out the letter to Hertz. Heidegger invokes the letter to Hertz because he maintains that the letter articulates Kant's first formulation of the problem of the a priori synthetic judgment, which Kant designates as the fundamental problem of the first critique. The letter conceives the problem of the synthetic a priori in terms of the relation between such judgments and the objects thus judged. It asks how a representation-object relation could obtain in cases where the representations, quote, are neither brought about by the object nor do they create the object itself. And that's A and B in the handout there. that a connection between this question and finite cognition can be seen as follows. Infinite subjectivity creates its objects, and so the representation-object relation proper to it is one in which the representation produces the object. That would be at the bottom there, B. Right? Therefore, insofar as finite subjectivity is receptive, its representation-object relation is one in which the representation doesn't produce the object. However, Kant also holds that the objects of finite cognition don't create its representations. According to Heidegger, Kant makes this claim because he recognizes that we must have an advanced understanding of the basic structure of things in order to experience and thus gain knowledge of the things so structured. And knowledge of things requires this pre-understanding because it makes experience of things possible. That is, unless we already comprehend that which makes a thing the thing that it is, we couldn't recognize and thus experience the thing as such. Kant then grounds knowledge of beings in the pre-understanding of the ontological constitution thereof. This is what is for Heidegger the understanding of being. Since this knowledge makes experience possible, it must precede experience, and so the representation-object relation obtaining in finite cognition is one in which the object doesn't produce the representation. That would be 2b there. Since we can now see how the question asked in the letter to Hertz is equivalent to the question concerning finite cognition. The representation-object relation that obtains in finite cognition can't be one in which the former produces the latter, since that's the representation-object relation that characterizes infinite cognition. The representation creates the object. Thus, in the representation-object relation characterizing finite cognition, neither term produces the other. The representation-object relation, and that's the representation-object relation that the letter to Hertz questions. Kant's fundamental problem, then, the possibility of a priori synthetic judgments, is the problem of finite cognition, which is a type of cognition in which the cognizing subject doesn't produce its object, nor vice versa. Thus, Kant's groundbreaking insight for Heidegger is that the finite subject's fundamental structure is that of spontaneous receptivity. Insofar as finite subjectivity's representations don't produce its objects, finite subjectivity is finite. It's receptive. But if all of its representations were produced by their objects, then it couldn't entertain representations of objects at all. Therefore, insofar as finite subjectivity's objects don't produce its representations, insofar as finite subjectivity is finite subjectivity, it's spontaneous. So there you see at just the bottom of the handout. If only A were the case, right, then it wouldn't be subjectivity. So the idea is that if the subjectivity is purely passive, it's not a subject because it has to have this pre-understanding. If subjectivity is purely active, it's not finite, it's creating its object. So finite subjectivity can't be completely passive or completely active, just like McDowell said. We can now see some clear similarities between Heidegger's and McDowell's assessments of Kant. First of all, they both see Kant's main discovery as the spontaneous receptive structure of human subjectivity. They also believe, now I gotta skip a look here, they also believe that Kant doesn't draw the ultimate conclusion of subjectivity's spontaneous receptive structure. And where you can see the difference between Heidegger and McDowell is in what they see as Kant's basic mistake here. For McDowell, he thinks Kant's mistake is clinging to the modern scientific conception of nature, and that therefore what you need is this idea of second nature that has both spontaneity and receptivity built into it. Now, what I think is important there is, here, the reason McDowell does that is because he says that without second nature, subjectivity's ability to recognize justifications is what he calls, in quoting him, mysterious, occult, or spooky. That is, McDowell's claim is without second nature, you have to posit a non-rational faculty in the human subject. Right? So the idea is that the idea is to look at what they're afraid of. What McDowell is afraid of, and what he sees Kant's problem being, is that Kant doesn't have a way of hooking up the mind with the world without having without having a non-rational faculty. All right. Heidegger's argument against Kant is precisely the opposite. As what Heidegger says is, Kant's problem is he doesn't realize that spontaneous receptivity is in fact non-rational. And that's, in a sense, what the whole point of Being in Time, and possibly of everything Heidegger ever did, was to show that subjectivity is in fact, and specifically spontaneous receptive subjectivity, is in fact non-rational. And that's the whole purpose of Being in Time, ultimately, is to show that. So what you have here is Heidegger and McDowell confronting, first of all, saying that Kant's main discovery is the spontaneous receptive structure of subjectivity. But then saying that Kant doesn't fully carry out the implications of that notion of subjectivity. And they have completely different, diametrically opposed solutions to what Kant failed to do. McDowell says, by putting in second nature, you preserve the rationality of subjectivity, so you better invoke second nature. Heidegger says, what spontaneous receptivity shows is that subjectivity really isn't rational at all. So it's a difference between someone trying to save rationality and someone trying to say the main object of philosophy is ultimately non-rational. So here, I'll just run the conclusion by now. If we were to take Heidegger and McDowell as representative of Continental and analytic philosophy, then the above confrontation between them would lead us to construe the difference between the traditions in terms of their willingness to allow ambiguity or indeterminacy, or in other words, irrationality, into their ontologies. While Heidegger's locating spontaneous receptivity outside of the sphere of rationality yields an ontologically indeterminate or irrational conception of subjectivity, that is Dasein, McDowell's locating spontaneous receptivity within the sphere of second nature preserves the rationality and thus the univocal determinacy of subjectivity. And while this distinction between those who admit the indeterminate and those who don't, or who admit the irrational and those who don't, may not be equivalent to the distinction between analytic and continental philosophers, it may be as good a heuristic principle as there is for ascertaining whether traditions part company. Construing the dividing line in this way, as between the philosophers who want to admit the irrational and those who don't, at least has the virtue of according with the relatively crude but perhaps not completely unwarranted caricatures that members of the traditions typically paint of their opponents, that is, continental philosophers as illogical and muddle-headed, and you can see why if they're trying to articulate something that's indeterminate or rational, and analytic philosophers as excessively reductive and scientistic, as being a symptom of this attempt to rationalize something that can be rationalized, come one may. So thank you very much.
Well, first, are there questions for Mark?
You want to do one, or maybe we should run through them all?
Well, if you stick to a half hour each, you'll make it.
We're sticking to 20 minutes. Okay.
I mean,
Yeah, okay. So like
I
a
mean,
10-minute.
right, because if you got to end at 4 on the nose, then you could do 6 minutes of questions now, and then Rob could start.
Okay.
And that way, it won't be too long in the
Yeah.
past at your paper.
Yeah. That was way too fast, but hopefully this handout, like.
Are we going to be able to get a copy of the papers, possibly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question?
Oh.
Yeah.
Would you say that in McDowell's interpretation of McDowell's rule-directed representations, that there's sort of a metaphysical element implied in the second nature?
Give me a little more on the metaphysical. I mean,
Because it seems hard to imagine, what are we talking about when we mean that the world has some sort of quality that allows itself to be interpreted,
Mhm.
that it has that has a quality of the world to be interpreted quality.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so in that sense, so you're asking, is he making a metaphysical or an ontological claim about the world, not just about subjectivity?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Or am I
and it seems like the Heideggerian interpretation avoids that need.
I would put it this way. I would say that they're both, although they're both talking about the structure of subjectivity, there are underlying ontological claims in what they're doing in both cases, right? So I'd say in McDowell's case, I would say what he's saying, one way of looking at what the ontological or metaphysical implications of what he's saying is that the world is not only a world of efficient causes and effects, but the world also has this other meaning dimension, which is that aspect that that human second nature connects with. Does that make sense? So it's sort of like he's making the ontological claim against the sort of natural scientific world picture, right, which he thinks Kant gets caught up in. He's making the claim that the world also has this meaning dimension, which is the world's ability, I think this is the way you just put it, the world's ability to be interpreted. And not only which would mean then that that the world has this other dimension that, I mean, on the one hand, yeah, there's a problem. It might look like, well, isn't that a kind of indeterminacy in the world, right? That it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But his claim would be that it isn't, that there's a kind of flexibility in the world because it can be interpreted in more than one way, which is why you need an active subject to interpret it, right? But at the same time, there's limits to how it can be interpreted. So ultimately, it's still, I think, a rational, determinate world. It's part of what he's doing is saying that the world has to have this second meaning dimension to it in order for it to be accessible to subjectivity. But still, but the world is still fully determinate because there's limits to how the world can get interpreted. Whereas from the Heideggerian point of view, what his conception of subjectivity as spontaneous receptivity implies that the world itself is also indeterminate. Because, I mean, just quickly, the way to see that is, he's got this notion of Dasein as that which, subjectivity is that which pre-understands being, which is what gives it this spontaneous receptive structure. But that which gets pre-understood, being, which is the underlying structure of the world, is itself indeterminate, just like Dasein is. So I think that they're both making metaphysical or ontological claims, although explicitly they're talking about subjectivity. And I think in both cases, what you can see is the ontological claims that they're making are still this idea that for McDowell, you've still got a rational, determinate world, even though it's got this second nature dimension to it, or what he calls the space of reasons. And that for Heidegger, the world that corresponds to his spontaneous receptive subject has this irrationality, this determinism to it.
I shouldn't have allowed you to take questions. No, I think we'll have to do more questions after.
Okay.
All right, so for those of you who came in a little bit late, there's a page, I have quotations from the paper, and I'll just indicate which ones we're at. So I start with a quotation from Gadamer. He writes, the fact that reward and punishment, praise and blame, exemplar and imitation, along with the ground of solidarity, sympathy, and love upon which their effect depends, that all these still form the ethos of humankind prior to all appeals to reason, and thus makes such appeals possible in the first place. This is the heart of Aristotle's ethics, and Kant does not do it justice. A prominent feature of John McDowell's naturalism of second nature is the philosophical significance that it accords to Aristotelian phronesis. Phronesis is the word that Aristotle uses. It's typically translated as practical wisdom. In this, McDowell self-consciously follows the lead of Gadamer, who appeals to phronesis as a model of hermeneutic understanding in Truth and Method, and throughout his later writings. Indeed, we hear a distinct echo of Gadamer's project in the way McDowell formulates the chief concern of mind and world. Quote, "We need to bring responsiveness to meaning back into the operations of our natural sentient capacities as such, even while we insist that responsiveness to meaning cannot be captured in naturalistic terms." End quote. This concern makes plain the appeal to phronesis, for according to McDowell, it is this sense of practical wisdom that best articulates the fully formed capacity of human nature to respond to rational demands. Of course, the nature which allows human beings to be responsive to such rational demands is the second nature that one acquires through language acquisition, ethical upbringing, and the resulting habits of thought and action. Nonetheless, this account allows for a thorough compatibility between nature and rationality, as McDowell indicates when he writes, quote, "In Aristotle's conception of human beings, rationality is integrally part of their animal nature, and the conception is neither naturalistic in the modern sense, there is no hint of reductiveness or foundationalism, nor fraught with philosophical anxiety," end quote. Again, echoing Gadamer, McDowell argues that the rationality constitutive of phronesis is made possible by tradition, quote, "a store of historically accumulated wisdom about what is a reason for what," end quote. And this appeal to tradition, in McDowell's words, promises to make it intelligible how, beginning as mere animals, human beings mature into beings at home in the space of reasons. Like Gadamer, McDowell stresses the perceptual character of phronesis, presenting it as a single sensitivity, an ability to recognize requirements that situations impose on one's behavior, a single complex sensitivity of this sort that we are aiming to instill when we aim to inculcate a moral outlook. That phronesis signifies a perceptual capacity explains for McDowell that famous remark of Aristotle that anyone who is to listen intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just, and generally about ethical matters, must have been brought up in good habits. For the "that" is the starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not at the start need the "because" as well. McDowell articulates the insight here as follows. This is the second quotation on that page. "In moral upbringing, what one learns is not to behave in conformity with rules of conduct, but to see situations in a special light, as constituting reasons for acting. This perceptual capacity, once acquired, can be exercised in complex, novel circumstances, not necessarily capable of being foreseen and legislated for by a codifier of the conduct required by virtue, however wise and thoughtful he might be." What follows from this conception is that the phronimos, or the one who has phronesis, knows what to do in a given situation, not by applying universal principles, but by being a certain kind of person, one who sees situations in a certain distinctive way. The reflection involved in moving from the "that" to the "because" does require some distance, as McDowell puts it, from the values of one's upbringing, but not the sort of distance which typically is fantasized as an external standpoint from which we might ground our values. Rather, having been brought up in such a way as to delight in noble actions, one will have obtained the "because" through that reflection which allows one to see these actions as preeminently worthwhile just because they are noble. Indeed, the appeal to reason, so distinctive of Aristotle's ethical theory, is, on this reading, simply a matter of seeing the worthwhileness of noble actions as giving a reason for performing them. For McDowell, this means that those who perform noble actions because they see them as preeminently worthwhile get it right. He always uses this language. Thus, the question, why should I conform to the dictates of morality, is not answerable independently of the moral tradition in question. Rather, McDowell contends, quote, what may happen is that someone is brought to see things as a virtuous person does, and so stops feeling the need to ask the question. End quote. To be sure, this presents a rather minimalist view of the logos operating within one's practical wisdom, and thus echoes some of Aristotle's more memorable statements on this issue. For example, in Book 1 of the Topics, Aristotle remarks on the proper scope of philosophical inquiry in such a way as to suggest a less than sanguine view of the reach of logos. This is a quote from the Topics. One ought not to inquire into every problem or thesis, but only those which someone might be puzzled about who is in need of arguments, not punishment or perception. For those who puzzle about whether one must honor the gods and care for one's parents or not need punishment, while those who puzzle about whether snow is white need perception. That's why we love Aristotle. This remark from the Topics, together with similar remarks from the Ethics, make clear that we can deliberate with one another as to why one must care for one's parents only by taking for granted that one must. And if someone is seriously puzzling over the that, he or she needs not argument, not logos, but something like moral re-education or punishment to obtain the that. We might think that obtaining the that in one's moral judgments is something altogether different from the example Aristotle uses of perceiving that snow is white. Yet Aristotle repeatedly portrays virtuous action as the exercise of a perceptual capacity. We ought to attend to the undemonstrated sayings and opinions of practically wise people, Aristotle says, quote, because experience has given them an eye to see aright. In this way, McDowell's minimalist view of the power of logos and practical wisdom would appear to be on stable Aristotelian ground. It should therefore come as no surprise that McDowell's view of ethics has been criticized as little more than unreflective conservatism. That is, the sort of criticism that has been directed at Gadamer and other thinkers in the tradition of Aristotle. One critic takes issue with McDowell's presentation of virtue as something thin and obvious, something that is very much like a natural habit or attitude of which we only need to be reminded. He writes, quote, although virtue is acquired as second nature in moral education, McDowell does not seem to think of it as something that deserves the kind of serious, sensitive, critical, and self-reflexive appropriation that we ordinarily associate with the process of acquiring values. McDowell does not seem to be inclined to think of it as something that deserves critical assessment. Unquote. But this criticism is just mistaken about McDowell's view. Time and again, McDowell has stressed the reflective, revisionary character of moral education through tradition, and he has done so again following Gadamer's thought. Taking his cue from Gadamer's conception of a free, distanced orientation in truth and method, McDowell writes that the idea of rational response requires subjects who are in charge of their thinking, standing ready to reassess what is a reason for what, and to change their responsive propensities accordingly. The same basic thought is presented in his, that is McDowell's, strange thought experiment that begins, suppose some wolves acquire reason. It's one of my favorite thought experiments. According to this thought experiment, we cannot allow ourselves to suppose that God, say, might confer reason on wolves, but stop short of giving them the materials to step back and frame the question, why should I do this? Thus it turns out that rationality not only makes possible, but in fact demands a certain reflective distance from the givenness of the moral tradition into which one has been initiated. This is the third quotation on that page. Moral education does not merely rechannel one's natural motivational impulses, with the acquisition of reason making no difference. In imparting logos, moral education enables one to step back from any motivational impulse one finds oneself subject to and question its rational credentials. Thus, it affects a kind of distancing of the agent from the practical tendencies that are part of what we might call his first nature. Nonetheless, McDowell repeatedly insists that this operation of distancing is a matter of the tradition's rational self-scrutiny. He writes, even a thought that transforms a tradition must be rooted in the tradition that it transforms. Perhaps the most interesting result of Gadamer's, McDowell's retrieval of phronesis is the interpretation offered of the reflective and revisionary character of deliberation. McDowell's rejection of what he calls the blueprint theory of deliberation, where deliberation involves no more than the application of a universal rule to a particular situation, shares Gadamer's emphasis upon the hermeneutic circle at work between the universality of one's ethical understanding and the particularity of the situation in which one must act. Consequently, the universal is constantly being revised as to its content. Only by rejecting the blueprint theory can we understand Aristotle's conception of deliberation, where ethical truth is not statable in universal terms, and where the discernment of the specifics of a situation is stressed. While the blueprint theory would allow for universal principles to be abstracted from the stable character of the phronimos, Aristotle's view is one in which the content of the end cannot be pinned down in abstraction from the ability to put it into practice in recognizing specific occasions for action. In this contrasting picture, McDowell writes, quote, there is nothing for grasp of the content of the universal to be, except a capacity to read the details of situations in the light of a way of evaluating actions into which proper upbringing has habituated one. It follows for McDowell and Gadamer that there can be no method for deliberating with a view to doing well, as the latter is genuinely interpretive. However, while McDowell follows Gadamer in allowing for thoroughgoing reflection upon one's principles as an essential part of deliberation, he neglects or at least underemphasizes the communal and hence dialogical character of this interpretive work. The dialogical character of interpretation is something made clear in Gadamer's explication of the ontological significance of language, and it is also something he stresses for the project coming to self-knowledge. This is a famous quote from Gadamer, only through others do we gain true knowledge of ourselves. Accordingly, we can see how deliberation would have to occur dialogically in an ethical culture like our own, where the prejudices enabling the interpretive work of deliberation are contestable, if not explicitly contested. Gadamer appreciates this specifically critical task of hermeneutics in distinguishing false from true prejudices, a task that seemingly requires one's engagement with others in dialogue, since we become aware of our prejudices, true or false, only by being provoked in the encounter with otherness. Indeed, it is precisely this aspect of Gadamer's thought that led Richard Bernstein to say, not implausibly, that, quote, what Gadamer himself is appealing to is a concept of truth which comes down to what can be argumentatively validated by the community of interpreters who open themselves to what tradition says to us. On this extension of Gadamer's view, reasons and arguments are the medium through which the communal dialogical work of deliberation takes place, since, as Bernstein puts it, reasons and arguments are fallible and anticipatory in the sense that they can be challenged and criticized by future argumentation. On this point, McDowell distinguishes himself from the Gadamerian view by the rather dismal prospects he holds out for argumentation, either across moral traditions or with someone who has slipped through the net of one's own tradition. That's his expression. McDowell addresses this issue most directly when he writes, and this is the fourth quotation, we surely do not need to embrace the massively implausible implication, and that's quite implausible, it's massively that someone who has not been properly brought up, someone who has slipped through the net, so to speak, can be induced into seeing things straight by directing some piece of reasoning at him. On the contrary, reasoning aimed at generating new motivations will surely stand a chance of working only if it appeals to something in the audience's existing motivational makeup. And the trouble with someone who has in some radical way slipped through the net is that there may be no such point of leverage for reasoning aimed at generating the motivations that are characteristic of someone who has been properly brought up. What it would take to get such a person to consider the relevant matters aright, we might plausibly suppose, is something like conversion. Here it seems McDowell is reminding us of Aristotle's remark in the Topics, albeit with sweet conversion in place of vinegary punishment. Presumably, the very artificiality of the expression directing some piece of reasoning is meant to convey the artificiality of moral argument as an enterprise. Not that McDowell is incapable of envisioning what effective argumentation would look like, but he is dissuaded from pursuing this vision any further simply because he doubts the possibility of finding any point of leverage in the interlocutors he imagines. But we may well wonder whether McDowell's and Aristotle's seemingly hasty appeal to conversion or punishment as opposed to argument does not arise from a limited, possibly distorted conception of moral argumentation. Rethinking the enterprise of moral argument in the spirit of Gadamer would lead us to raise critical questions about McDowell's conception of argument in order to theorize what Bernstein describes as a form of argumentation that seeks to warrant what is valid in tradition. Okay, well, let me just tell you now, I can just kind of speak extemporaneously about where the paper goes from here. I use Gadamer to piece together a view of argumentation that would allow us to understand ethics on the model of phronesis, stressing its perceptual capacity, its reliance upon a living moral tradition in which one is brought up. But at the same time, there has to be a way to dialogically work out differences that we have within the tradition, and the fact that we don't all see situations in the same light, and thus we come into conflict. Now, on this sheet that I gave you of the quotations, I give you an example from Honora O'Neill. This quotation, over in my paper, she writes here, for McDowell, the sheer fact of agreement must be the basis of ethics, yet ethical difference and disagreement are pervasive in contemporary life, and the prospect of ignoring them or dealing with them by mere convergence of perception is vanishingly slender. The analogy between sensory and ethical perception is strained. When we deal with disagreement, we need to contrast and debate, to compare and infer. In doing so, we formulate and we follow varied rules of varying scope. Now, her criticism, and this I think is a fairly traditional one, is that since we have to argue, we have to bring in universal moral principles as part of that argumentation. Whereas the Aristotelian ethicist would want to say that we can't abstract universal moral principles from the outset. In fact, our moral lives are such that we only get to be clear about what we're committed to in the process of facing situations that require action on our part. So we would want to shy away from the view that ethical disagreement as such requires universal moral principles as you get in Kantian ethics. A competing or alternative view is one that you get from Charles Taylor, and so I developed his account of ad hominem argumentation. Now, Taylor is very much influenced by Gadamer, and there are a couple other theorists writing today, Paul Christopher Smith and Eugene Garver, who are also working on this problem of argumentation, a kind of argumentation that would go hand in hand with Aristotle's ethics. So if you look at this sixth quotation, this one is from Charles Taylor. He gives you a sense of what this other way of arguing would look like. He says, People of naturalist temper quite understandably look for their models of argument and proof to mathematics or the natural sciences. In the latter sphere, at least, we strive for models of modes of argument which could ideally demonstrate to an opponent the truth of a thesis, starting from considerations which both sides have to accept, regardless of their starting theoretical positions. Applied to ethical arguments, this model would involve offering someone a reason for adopting a certain ethical position, which would have to be recognized as a reason, whatever the interlocutor's ethical outlook. Giving a reason in this sense means finding some external consideration, not anchored in our moral intuitions, which can somehow show that certain moral practices and allegiances are correct. Ad hominem argument does not offer us a consideration we have to acknowledge quite independently of our ethical intuitions. Rather, it is an attempt to articulate these intuitions, to make them more perspicuous and palpable. If you do convince your interlocutor by your discourse about a good, it will be because the good so articulated moves him. That is, he comes to recognize it as an expression of his ethical intuitions. And I thought about the case suggested in the example from Aristotle of wondering about whether to care for one's parents. Okay, so this seems rather abstract to you youngins, but as we get older, our parents will be in a situation of requiring some care, even as they cause us enormous difficulty, right? I mean, this is what happens to people. Now, it's not. The question is not whether one must care for one's parents, but you could imagine someone distraught because of an inability to deal with or to handle the suffering of a parent, just wanting to step away from it and say, I can't handle this, I can't deal with caring for my parent in this way. Now, what would the kind of argument that a friend would engage a friend in this kind of situation, what would it involve? Well, surely it wouldn't involve the kind of argument where we appeal to something external that would involve a necessary conclusion that yes, one must care for one's parents. But rather, it would be a way of articulating intuitions that your friend already has. And so this approach to argument, which really is just a new version of Socratic alenkos, is a way of trying to bring your interlocutor to clarity about him or herself. Now, we are such beings as are most often not very clear about our own underlying commitments. And so we require others to help us get clear about what exactly we are committed to. And philosophy should be able to step in here. The view of ad hominem argument that I'm developing would be argument along these lines. That's it. Yeah. I think we only have a couple minutes before we turn it over to Todd.
I'm wondering, Mark said that for McDowell, second nature saves rationality in the world, and then the way you talked about second nature as putting us in a certain way of seeing, so that we can discuss the questions, but we don't ask whether they ever come up, because somehow that seems to me something different than rationality. And I'm wondering what the connection is, or how those can both be the case.
Yeah, well, in a way, it's a discussion that goes on even about Aristotle's view, because I have to say, when I first started reading Aristotle, I was completely underwhelmed. I thought, I thought he was going to give me a reason or a grounding for my moral convictions in the way of apodeixis, or some kind of real demonstration. when in fact it's exactly what McDowell calls a reflective affirmation of the moral convictions that you already have as a consequence of upbringing. Not that we don't have any distance from them, and so we can come to say, you know, yeah, why can't same-sex couples get married, right? I mean, we value the institution of marriage. Marriage is actually something that we are morally committed to, and therefore, precisely for that reason, we should extend it to same-sex couples. Now that's a way of taking the tradition and revising it, but in line with its own underlying moral commitments, right? It's not that we somehow move away from the tradition to some alternative rationality, but I think the idea here is that already in being socialized and brought up within a culture that gives you a sense of what to pursue in life, what to avoid, there's an underlying rationality that is potent enough to revise continually at every moment those values while still being coherent as a tradition. And so, yeah, that sense of rationality, you know, earlier on, it was underwhelming to me, and yet I've come to think that that really is the only way in which reasoning can occur with ethics. That otherwise, that there's we're just doomed to an inability to give any rational grounding to our moral commitments. I don't know.
Well, yeah, we could, but it then would be spinning frictionless or something, giving a coherent moral system.
And I don't know if this helps or hurts, but the reason that, the way that I see it, that he needs second nature to preserve rationality is because otherwise you've got a non-natural dimension to the human being, its connection with the space of reasons. And the claim that he makes is that if that's non-natural, then it's non-human, because he says a human being is a kind of species of animal. And so if you lose the natural, you lose the human, and now you've got a non-human dimension to humans, and he says that makes no sense. So that's why he's committed to naturalism, right? Because otherwise you've got an irrational picture of what a human being is.
I mean, without
Yeah.
This might, you might,
do we have?
you got 2 minutes, maybe you
Yeah.
can just do a quick one on this. In that final example where you talk about a friend talking to another friend about taking care of the parents, how would you re-describe the situation where these two friends both believe in the commandments in a very literalistic way, and so one friend is reminding the other friend of a kind of absolute principle? Would that also, so that seems like it stands up as a counterexample to the kind of discursive narrative reinterpretation of, you know, what are we doing in this life and what's valuable to us kind of description that came out of the Bernstein quote.
Mm-hmm.
So could the situation where someone is reminding someone about a commandment, about honor thy father and mother, could that also be re-described in this sort of ongoing discursive scenario?
Oh yeah, I think so. And I mean, Gadamer himself is very good on this issue since he's a believing Christian, and so what he always appeals to is, you know, the underdetermined character of the commandments or the scriptures. They always require interpretation, and so for him, there's always the belief going into it that that commandments command toward the good, that there is some rationality after all to the commandments. But once you accept that constraint, then you're dealing with a difficult interpretive situation of making sense of the commandment in light of, you know, life's difficulties. So.
Well, Habermas, Heidegger, Gadamer, now Habermas. I'm going to skip the first for those of you with the copies, I'm gonna skip the first paragraph because it just kind of recapitulates, McDowell's, ideas about where ethics fits, and he uses ethics as an exemplar of the way in which reason and nature can be construed as inextricable. So I'm gonna start with the second paragraph, so don't think about that introduction. Habermas too acknowledges ways in which the intentions of modernity have been fractured and gone astray. However, unlike McDowell, he sees modernity's cognitive potentials as a way to correct a life praxis still dependent on blind traditions. He insists that moral statements can be justified, therefore must have cognitive content, and that this content approaches an ethically neutral form for decentered individuals and societies. Such recognition of norms that supersede the parochial in a post-traditional, pluralistic world is imperative for Habermas. In the absence of substantive agreement on particular norms, the participants must now rely on the neutral fact that each of them participates in some communicative form of life which is structured by linguistically mediated understanding. Here, Habermas follows the lead of Hegel, Humboldt, and Mead in philosophy, speech act theorist in linguistic pragmatics, Piaget and Kohlberg in moral psychology, and the historicist perspective of his own teachers, Gadamer and Adorno. He expands and interweaves these theories into a strong cognitivist argument for the possibility of context-transcendent moral validity claims. Habermas's writings contain only rare engagements with McDowell, and McDowell has none with Habermas. Habermas's few references reveal intense skepticism as to whether McDowell's moral theory, which Habermas categorizes as weak cognitivism, is sufficient to explain how reliance on Aristotelian practical reason, even though there is a role for insight, can ever rise above particular forms of life, a feature of morality so necessary in a post-metaphysical world. Once questions of justice arise across cultures, subcultures, or nations, such neo-Aristotelian views reveal their limitations for maintaining the absolute priority of the right over the good and fall short of the universalistic content of a morality of equal respect and solidaristic respect for everyone. While there are surprising similarities in the relaxed naturalisms of Habermas and McDowell, Habermas's stronger form of cognitivism reduces attention in McDowell's argument regarding the relationship between potentialities and upbringing, Bill Dome. In fact, McDowell's weak cognitivism is never convincing as to why one moral language game is superior to another. Like other neo-Aristotelian standpoints, it doesn't transcend community in the way Habermas's formal pragmatics provides a neutral procedure to adjudicate conflict. Habermas submits strenuous objections to moral realism, the camp in which he places McDowell. While both share Habermas's goal of describing norms and values from a post-metaphysical perspective, Habermas accuses McDowell of assimilating value judgments to factual statements. McDowell, in fact, has a nuanced view of the relationship of facts and values, but gaps and tensions remain. Habermas's discourse ethics fill a gap in McDowell's analysis. Habermas places moral validity claims in an analogous position to truth, but not as mirroring the objective content of the world. He offers a form of practice, of deliberation, that injects a commonality in the realm of discourse that can rise above or decenter participants from the particularities of their own backgrounds. Complementary rather than oppositional to McDowell's hermeneutical purposes, Habermas's arguments provide a specificity that can both meet gender and cross-cultural challenges and account for normative justifications in a post-traditional world. Reflecting the mood of their respective traditions, analytic and continental philosophy, McDowell and Habermas each respond differently to the linguistic term. Habermas is historically located in a generation of post-World War II philosophers who were profoundly influenced by both the hermeneutic approach and the analytic tradition. They accepted the complementarity of the traditions and would neither relinquish the cognitive, that is the semantic, nor the intersubjective aspects of language to the a priori of meaning. Unwilling to mistake being true with taking for true, This generation carefully balances background conditions and culture against knowledge of the world as it is. These ideas are central to Habermas as a continental thinker, but they are not absent from McDowell's arguments. McDowell's ubiquitous references to Gadamer's hermeneutics, to Wittgenstein's forms of life, and his full-blown critique of modernity's scientism provide an entry point to show McDowell's frequent departures from the analytic movement. He relies on Weber's well-known term for the Enlightenment stripping of the world of meaning and values, disenchantment, in much the same way that Habermas does. McDowell and Habermas agree that post-Enlightenment thought has left us with the unfortunate position of thinking that because we can't place meaning and values in the scheme of the natural sciences, we must therefore relegate them to mere subjectivity. And both have developed theories to mitigate this claim. Supporting his anti-scientistic position, McDowell explains how modern science understands its subject matter as necessarily disenchanted and marks off two kinds of intelligibility: natural science and the logic of reason. The former, that is, causes, are completely rent from the latter, meaning. While this represents an achievement of modern over medieval thought, it has become an idea that now has to be reworked to relieve philosophy's anxieties. He presents a version of Aristotelian ethics wherein we can reunite reason and virtue as an exemplar of the broader issue of the relationship of reasons with naturalness. Habermas too is dedicated to Weber and derives the bulk of his theory from detailed evaluation of Weber's work, and in fact devotes the majority of Volume 1, 465 pages of his masterwork, to the theory of communicative action, to the rationalization of modern society as a result of disenchantment. His theories of communicative action and later discourse ethics work out the problems of the overly rationalized society, and in particular of ethical rationalization. Both McDowell and Habermas draw upon Weber to demonstrate how ethical theory can be used as a lens through which to view and relieve modern tensions. McDowell reserves for naturalism a specialized definition, one that has been rethought and is not glossed in terms of the realm of the law, and brings responsiveness to meaning back into the operations of our natural sentient capacities. He supports a minimal empiricism in that experience should be answerable to the world. He supports, borrowing from Kant, McDowell employs the faculty of spontaneity to express what he means by understanding and its relationship to the world as it is. These conceptual capacities cannot place things in the realm of the law, but this understanding, or spontaneity, is implicated with receptivity, that is, our senses which are part of nature. Therefore, in another sense, conceptual capacities must be natural. Since our conceptual capacities largely constitute our nature as humans, our nature is largely second nature, and our second nature is the way it is not just because of the potentialities we are born with, but also because of our upbringing, our bildung. Our conceptual capacities then are inextricably joined to nature. McDowell extends this argument to show how, in the same way, norms and values are connected to facts about what really is so. In fact, the dimension of value from fact is derived from a deeper dualism to which modern philosophy ought to respond. McDowell rejects a philosophical realism that argues that to know what really is so is beyond our cognitive powers. He urges a different realism, one that reserves room not only for explicating the relationship of our thoughts to reality, but also for values. He claims space for realism in a different sense about values. That normative questions have genuine cognitive content is of course key for Habermas. He too argues vehemently against the non-cognitivist view of ethics. However, two ideas move his view toward a strong cognitivism. One differentiates norms from values, and two places language as the definitive mediator in the justification of moral validity. These two features permit the reconciliation through public use of reason that enables adjudication of conflicts that cross cultural lines and allow us to transcend context in order to achieve an understanding of principles that are universally applicable in the Kantian sense without the a priori. That norms differ from values is key to Habermas's entry into how we can treat moral justifications in a pluralistic world. Values can constitute the particular concepts of the good that drive particular groups. Informed decisions about what conduct is most desirable are subject to gradual as opposed to binary coding and are relative and not absolute in their bindiness. They compete for priority shift and engender tensions. Norms, on the other hand, inform what we ought to do, have the obligatory force of a universal duty and are exceptionless in whether they are valid or invalid. How do individuals and societies derive these norms? We do this, according to Habermas, through intersubjective experience with language. We salvage truth by coming to understand the germ of reason carried in language itself. Habermas is not referring here to assertoric or propositional statements, that is semantics, but to the pragmatics of language. Ought statements have binary validity claims, yes or no, which are analogous but not identical to truth. We recognize unavoidable validity claims in the presuppositions of argument that exist across languages through a developmental process that moves individuals from egocentric to post-conventional and societies from parochial to cosmopolitan. Influenced by early German philosophers such as Humboldt, Herder, and Hamann, and their linguistic turn against Kant, and pushing those insights with the help of Austin, Searle, Mead, Piaget, and Kohlberg, Habermas creates a discourse theory that locates moral validity claims in the pragmatic presuppositions of language, specifically those intrinsic to argumentation. Habermas shows us how this amounts to more than mere conventions that prejudge everything else, but are inescapable presuppositions. But real-world discourse is required to derive these presuppositions, since they cannot be derived from hypothetical argument in an individual's mind. Finally, they have cognitive meaning that can be treated like truth claims. Both McDowell and Habermas rejected dualism between nature and reason, and both used discussions of moral philosophy to illustrate the connection of getting things right in conceptual capacities. They refuse to disengage thinking from the world and insist upon implicating ethics in this connection without invoking metaphysical claims. Such claims render them weak or relaxed naturalists, as opposed to transcendentalist skeptics, rampant Platonists, or bald naturalists. But Habermas indicts McDowell as a moral realist, albeit a subtle one, accusing him of postulating a kind of perceptual experience that intuitively grasps values. These intentions form the basis of value judgments which are assimilated to factual statements. McDowell will not accept this label. He prefers anti-realist. He urges something more negative than positive, in that anti-realist positions such as emotivism or projectivism are responses to a misconception of the significance of the obvious fact that the ethical and the more generally evaluative thinking is not science. In conjunction with being an anti-realist, McDowell, like Habermas, is a full-blown anti-non-cognitivist. That is, they each unequivocally reject a position that refuses any cognitive content to moral questions. But according to Habermas, McDowell's anti-non-cognitivism results merely in a weak cognitivism. To elucidate that spontaneity captures patterns in the way we live, McDowell relies on Aristotle's ethics of assorted naturalism that couples virtue with the demands of reason. Our modern need to leave nature disenchanted in order to exclude supernaturalism accounts for our reluctance to accept Aristotle's idea that a mature human is a rational animal, at the same time hold on to the Kantian notion of sui generis rationality. McDowell's different interpretation of naturalism couples reason and perceptual sensitivity to experience, and this spontaneity is inextricably joined to virtue. The junction of reason and virtue provides McDowell with his quintessential exemplar of second nature. Virtue is a rational, self-conscious disposition, and is, in fact, knowledge for McDowell as it is for Socrates. The objectivity that this implies, in conjunction with McDowell's portrayal of value as a reliable sensitivity that is akin to a perceptual capacity, forces him to contend with non-cognitivist objections. This anti-non-cognitivist argument serves as a powerful scaffold for his cognitivist claims, which in the end, Habermas will argue are not strong enough. I will argue below that Habermas specifies the requirements of McDowell's required sensitivities through language and cognitive developmental theory. These moves flesh out what McDowell leaves unspecified and adds the necessary features to transform him from a weak to a strong from a weak to the strong cognitivist necessary to adjudicate the merits of one form of life over another. Cognitivism of any stripe asks, cognitivism of any stripe in ethics asks, how are we to retain the identification of knowledge with virtue? How do we formulate what kind of knowledge virtue is? McDowell addresses non-cognitivist objections to his cognitivist position by contesting three assumptions. 1, cognition and volition are distinct. 2, knowledge must have stable propositional content. 3, knowledge must be guided by formulable universal principles that entail formulable rules and a decision procedure for conflict. So he's going to contest these three. The first, that cognitive and appetitive appetites are independent and the latter do not result in reliable judgments as to how things are, McDowell dismisses as Philistine scientism, a vestige of 18th century philosophy that does not have a standpoint in place to describe our human perception of saliences. He disputes this scientific conception of reality by arguing that when we ask the metaphysical question whether reality is something science can find out about, we cannot, without begging the question, restrict the materials for an answer that science can countenance. McDowell rejects the non-cognitivist second quality argument, which he views as parallel to the above. He questions whether we need to invoke non-cognitivist propensities to endow the world with value qualities it already has, and rejects the direct comparison of recognizing values to recognizing colors. The second non-cognitivist assumption is as suspect for Habermas as it is for McDowell. Both deny that ethical claims can be formulated into statable propositional content. McDowell reminds us of Aristotle's understanding that virtue is not codifiable. McDowell's argument rests on the idea that the major premise in the virtue syllogism cannot be definitively stated and is an approximation at best, an erectic state that cannot be universalized. Habermas agrees that assertions are not necessary, but instead he proposes codification without recourse to truth propositions. He insists that moral validity claims are analogous to truth claims, but not identical to them. Moral validity claims are based on pragmatic and not semantic presuppositions. This permits him to propose a rational, albeit pragmatic, decision procedure that cuts across contexts, something that McDowell praises Aristotle for resisting. Yet Aristotle's presuppositions of argumentation figure centrally into Habermas's discourse ethics. He reworks them into inescapable presuppositions that emerge from people interacting communicatively and ultimately transcending mere convention to result in more abstract general norms of justice in increasingly more complex societies. Norms that were once embedded in comprehensive worldviews and forms of life are sublimated into a procedural concept of impartial evaluation that then in turn defines justice. This procedure emerges historically as the relationship of content and form is reversed in the transition from traditional to modern society. Substantive concepts of justice evolve into thinner and more abstract terms for impartial judgment. Habermas holds that hermeneutic insights come back into play in the discourse of application, and so the values of a particular worldview are always in sight without resorting to a position that cannot adjudicate rightness among forms of life. In this way, Habermas shows a decision procedure to adjudicate conflict that can be construed, that uses pragmatic presuppositions, not propositional statements, to demonstrate how we access rightness that already exists in the world without assimilating that rightness to truth. Habermas provides an alternative rational procedure, one that assesses validity claims analogous but not identical to truth, thereby rejecting McDowell's refusal of the assumption 3 above regarding the impossibility of a decision procedure. Hence, Habermas retains his cognitivism all the way through. And then I'll just improvise the rest because I guess it's getting pretty close. So, and then the last, section 4 just talks about how how both of them would fit in a what we call a post-traditional world, and that Habermas's points of view elaborate or specify the things that McDowell leaves so unspecific that you wouldn't have a way to adjudicate conflicts across cultures. And so I kind of talk about this and how Habermas exploits what he does, his presuppositions of argumentation, to flesh out what reflection would look like. And McDowell, and I have some quotes in here, McDowell himself admits that he does not, give enough attention to reflection, to the role that language plays. And although he invokes, while McDowell invokes Gadamer quite often in his language, he never elaborates the role of hermeneutics or historicism, or specifies the role of language in the process of reflection, and so on. I won't read more. I have more to say about that. And that, and then finally, I just talk about the idea that some people have critiqued Habermas as being so traditionally epistemological that he's Eurocentric and that he doesn't account for example, gendered epistemology, some kind of an epistemology that's contingent on one's own history. So in the last part of this paper, I argue for Habermas, my friend Habermas, and say that he really isn't subject to that kind of critique, and that his work shows us how we can. His work doesn't require a single interpretation of the world in order to ultimately derive a single right answer. And I use Honefer and Christina Lafont, who's both people who write about Habermas. And then finally, he says we do need a set of normative justifications in the world as it is today. And he says here's why neo-Aristotelian approaches fall short. Yeah. Really fast.
I have a question. Is there a short version of the difference between a pragmatic presupposition and a propositional statement? Or just like how they function differently, or?
Yeah, because like a pragmatic presupposition is about intentionality in language, the processes behind. I mean, I had more about it originally, and that he draws on Aristotle, interestingly enough, on this. And Aristotle has these levels of, and I have it in the footnote back, these levels of argumentation that are not content specific, but rather more specific to the processual aspects of argumentation. So there really isn't a short answer, and I kind of put it in a footnote because I didn't want to get into it too deeply. But it might be something for me to think about as a quick and easy way to explain that.
It just seems like it's important for
yeah.
the whole adjudicating problem.
And
so you don't need propositional statements to do it, right?
Right, that you need what he calls validity claims. And they're very abstract claims about solidarity and justice and so on. Generalizable interests, that's another thing I didn't read because it was toward the end, the notion of generalizable interests of people across contexts. But that might be something to think about, maybe just doing a quick definition of that, not just leaving it in a footnote, in a footnote. Another question?
No, I forgot where it was. Okay, is what you were just telling Mark about pragmatic presuppositions, what you were referring to earlier in the paper when you say that Habermas specifies the requirements of McDowell's required sensitivities. Is that what they are? What does Habermas add, I guess? What is this specification? that you're talking about?
These adjudicating procedures that he says are abstract and thin, that are context transcendent, that rely on, see, he uses a lot of the work of like people like John Searle and Austin and those pragmatic linguistics people, pragmatics of language people, where they've kind of, laid out how it is that we understand language, not based on semantic truth. Just a simple example would be, like a sarcastic statement, or they want to set out ways in which we understand people's intentions in language without charting out the proposition per se. So if children do it a lot of examples from children, and children say, they come to your house and they see cookies on the shelf, and they say, my mother lets me have cookies, meaning, it's not, so, meaning.
I know what it means.
So it's like, that there's a pragmatic presupposition there that it relies on, rather than a truth-based presupposition. That, Speech Act theory, I mean, he relies very heavily on, I've just written other papers on Speech Act theory and Holocaust, I don't wanna say the same thing all the time. But I mean, that might be a thing to elaborate a
So
little
these are the
bit.
kinds of things that are involved in what McDowell leaves as just kind of required
Yeah, just that he
sensitivities.
says.
This is part of the acculturation,
Right.
socialization that.
Yeah, like he says, he doesn't say much about language, McDowell. He said, by his own admission, when you read those afterwards in Mind in World, he says, yeah, I know I kind of give short shrift to language, and, I don't say as much as I ought to. Language discloses the world, but I really don't say as much as I ought to about language, even though he loves to invoke, Gadamer and, and so on. So, it seems to me that Habermas, without being oppositional to, completely oppositional to McDowell, lays out a specification of, what could we say about language without resorting to propositional statements?
So language as part of second nature.
Yes, and to think about it that way, as that aspect, because McDowell's so down on propositional, that he's so down on the assumption that you can lay everything out propositionally when it comes to values, when it comes to ethics.
Yeah.
So he's so down on that Habermas is saying, well, me too, I'm down on that too, but let's think of another way we could invoke language here and specify the requirements of adjudication without being dependent on assertions.
Yeah.